Our next speaker is a pretty good advert for how far you can go when you start out as a copywriter. He rose rapidly through the ranks at Ogilvy, working on brands such as Amex, BT, Microsoft and more, and was one of the first to see the potential of digital marketing. He became ECD at Ogilvy in 1998 and Vice Chairman of the Ogilvy Group in the UK in 2005. Today, he's a genuine thought leader in the advertising world and beyond, combining insights from psychology, behavioural economics and his own experience into a unique philosophy of marketing. He is, of course, Rory Sutherland.
Oh, sorry about this. I'd absolutely like to echo that point that as a breed we need to be more like Zippy and less like George, in that we have become, I think, and it's not entirely our fault, and I'll explain some of the reasons as I go through, but we've become quite deferential because we operate in the area of business activity, or indeed government activity, which is, broadly speaking, deals with subjective matters. And we're operating in a culture where actually there's a kind of bizarre and fetishistic obsession with a kind of faux objectivity. So the problem I have is that, broadly speaking, the business culture of today means that anybody with a spreadsheet or a numerical case or a mathematical model will, by default, win an argument over someone who only has abstract nouns to use. And it's hugely problematic. It's also actually dangerous for the companies themselves because in many cases these models are being used really for support rather than illumination. They're a kind of defensive position, which is the more it can appear that my business decision was based on some objective mathematical model, the less I may have to suffer any poor consequences from that decision. So there's an element of objectivity being used as a form of personal reputational insurance, to be honest, not really to genuinely improve the quality of decision-making. And so my contention here, very simply, I co-founded a thing, being accurate, called Ogilvy Change, which is there to effectively form really healthy links between the best of the academic social sciences, including, but not confined to, behavioural economics, and what we do in business and advertising, with the aim, partly, of just massively expanding the remit of what agencies are asked to do. At the moment, as an agency, you deal purely with the marketing department, you are funded exclusively from the marketing budget, and the kind of problems you're given to solve typically are, well, we've decided all the serious stuff in an off-site meeting in Slough 6 months ago, and as a final kind of tactical consequence of our decision, we may need some pretty pictures produced, and so we're going to hand that to you. Now, I'll give you just a couple of examples of what we've been doing most recently. 2 psychology graduates, average age 25, travel up to a northern call centre, which is the main call centre for one of our clients. They spend the morning listening to the phone calls. They spend the lunch break suggesting tiny tweaks to the call script and to the conversational style of the call centre staff, based on what is known of behavioural science, and then at about 4 o'clock, these 2 24-year-olds travel back on the train. We call back 3 weeks later. What's happened? The conversion rate of the call centre has more than doubled, with the addition of tiny little things. I'll give you just one example of one of the 5 little things. We suggested 7 or 8. A few of them, the call centre staff said, yeah, it doesn't sound right. I don't quite feel natural saying that. We said, fine, leave it. An example would be during the course of a call, to make a purchase, you had to choose A, B, or C, 3 different pricing options. We don't know the individual effect of the 5 interventions we suggested. We did all 5 simultaneously, but this, I would suspect, is perhaps one of the most potent. You simply added the sentence, instead of saying you can choose A, B, or C, you simply rephrased it as most people choose B, but you can also choose A or C. And the second example of what we did is going to a Chilean food factory to work out ways to change human behaviour among the employees of that factory to reduce food contamination and the risk thereof. I can't tell you what the solution was because the client then decided they wanted to patent it and actually make it into a product. But I will be able to tell you in a month or so. Now, the reason we have this problem is that we know much more than we know, but the form of knowledge we have is actually quite a common form of knowledge among practitioners. We instinctively know a fantastic amount. All of you as writers have a very, very brilliantly honed instinct, I hope, for how people actually think, decide, and act. The problem we have is a separate one, which is the advertising industry has known a lot about behavioural science for years and years and years. It's never attempted to codify it. And that's its gross failing. This is, by the way that science most often happens. Businesses generally, and business people, are decades ahead of academics in the actual practice. Where they completely fail and academics succeed, and in some cases you might argue claim the credit, is in the simple business of codifying the thing and forming it into some sort of coherent story and system. Now, I'll give you a few examples of this. People were building really, really good steam engines in the UK decades before anybody had a clue about thermodynamics. The Wright brothers' flyer was actually in the Science Museum in London until 1948 because the Americans didn't want it. And the reason they didn't want it is until about the late 40s, they refused to acknowledge that the Wright brothers had pioneered powered flight because they had a huge government program full of scientists who are trying to do the same thing. And it was simply a national humiliation that two bicycle repairmen, basically two people running a bicycle shop in Ohio had beaten them to it. And that's because business people generally use sort of stochastic experimentation, trial and error, and you build brilliant steam engines by effectively trying things, seeing what happens, doing a bit more. It's an evolutionary process. But I would argue we have failed as an advertising industry, and there are complicated reasons why, in taking what we instinctively knew, the System 1 knowledge we had, and actually converting it into a form that would enable you to win an argument. I'll give you just a few examples of where the ad industry was ahead of its time. Plink Plink Fizz for Alka-Seltzer understood social norms years before anybody used the phrase social norm. The idea behind it was very simply, if you created the idea that it was normal to use 2 Alka-Seltzer at a time when most people were only using 1, you'd double your sales. Sure enough, sales did go up by about 65%. I mean, some people were using 2 already. I generally, my heuristic with all medication is recommended dose plus 1. Because, my assumption is they're leaving a hell of a margin for error here. Let's just take an extra one. Okay? And some people refuse to be nudged, okay? I'll explain the genius behind No One Ever Got Fired for Buying IBM. It's an example of actually understanding something I didn't know the name for until last month. It's called defensive decision making. It's a very, very strong human System 1 instinct. Possibly most brilliant of all, framing and anchoring. How many people, by the way, have read Nudge or, for example, Predictably Irrational, or Robert Cialdini's book on influence and persuasion? I mean, definitely, for God's sake, read those. Not necessarily because you'll learn from it, although I think you will, because there's always more you can learn, but actually for the glorious feeling you'll have of finally being able to win an argument when you know you're instinctively right, but lack the vocabulary to make your case. And we've particularly done ourselves a disservice here because marketing has the worst vocabulary in the world. In that, as one brilliant colleague of mine put it, he said, the vocabulary of marketing is like the vocabulary of astrology. It's perfectly fine if you're talking to fellow believers, okay? But it's absolutely hopeless if you're talking to anybody outside the sect. And if you think about astrology, I don't know if anybody here does believe in astrology, but you can sit there with your astrological friends and go, oh, girlfriend's playing up or boyfriend's playing up a bit at the moment. Ooh, I know, they're a Sagittarius. They're like that, aren't they, right? And between the two of you, that's a perfectly sane and reasonable conversation. To anybody outside your group, you're borderline deranged. In fact, you possibly should be institutionalized fairly quickly, okay? And marketing's like that. It's fine if you're talking to fellow marketers to talk about brand iconography or the power of white space, okay? But going to a chief financial officer and talking about brand iconography is basically like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington and saying, we must all trust to the healing power of the crystal. That's basically what it sounds like, okay? And we really have to watch this. Now, the real value, I admit this freely, behavioral economics, actually as a phrase, is actually a bit of a cunning little bit of rebranding. Okay? It's actually psychology. And there are people like Steven Pinker at Harvard and Daniel Gilbert who go absolutely bananas about this because they claim it's a bunch of economists who are late to the game claiming credit for something that psychologists knew all along. By the way, they are absolutely right, but I don't listen, and let me explain why. It's very simple. If I say I want to talk to you about behavioral economics, the finance director will say, I need to know about that. If I go and say I'm prepared to do a talk about psychology, the finance director goes, not my field, clear off. It's a Trojan horse rebranding of psychology, but frankly, it's just necessary for that reason. So this is my obsession, that agencies and marketers and the talent that sits in this room is too small a part of the economy. This is a really obscure book, but it's brilliant. Has anybody read it? Okay, it essentially suggests that what has happened, to some extent, in the modern world is that left-brained thinking and argument has actually run away with decision-making. The proper mode of decision-making is effectively the unconscious instinctive brain comes up with an idea, passes it to the more rational brain for appraisal, rational brain reports back, emotional brain decides. So it's, broadly speaking, if you see what happens in a business, chief executive has an idea, goes to CFO, unless like Tesco you haven't got one for 6 months, well, park on that one, goes to CFO and says, what do you think of this? CFO comes back with, well, that could be good, but you have to watch this and that. Chief executive decides. And within the brain, there should be that kind of duality, that complementary thinking. What Ian McGilchrist claims is, he doesn't use this analogy because he's a neuroscientist and a literary critic, doesn't know much about business, I'm guessing. But what actually happens now is the CEO has an idea, the CFO appraises it, and then makes the decision based on his own appraisal without reporting back. That large areas of institutional decision-making effectively have been seized control of by a kind of arithmocracy, who, because they control numbers, they therefore control effectively the language of argument and discourse, because numbers, however rubbish they are, have the appearance of objectivity. And this is his book. Read it because it's fascinating. This is my particular take on it. This is my complaint, which was before I read this book, which is I don't mind the fact that creative and imaginative people have to submit their ideas to people more rational than themselves. I don't want, when I fly on a plane, I don't want to think that the people checking the wheel nuts are wildly imaginative people who are allowed to go unpoliced, okay? What I object to, though, is that the process doesn't happen the other way around. Rational people, when they think, the McKinsey folk, who think, yes, we've got a clear model for improving efficiency here, okay? When they come up with that, they never go to creative, more emotional, more subjectively minded people, more system one-minded people, and say, do you think what we're doing makes sense? So you have this imbalance, which is that creativity is very heavily policed, and my problem here is that creativity is heavily policed, but shallow rationality is allowed to run rampant. If you've got a fairly shallow idea, that goes unchanged. I had a wonderful conversation with somebody about this yesterday. We were talking about call centres and the way that, if you get a consulting firm in, they will entirely ask questions about how to make the call centre more efficient. Okay, we'll get people working part-time on part-time contracts. We'll employ people, who, allow them to work from home so we can actually just only pay them for the hours they work and reduce travel time. We'll cut holiday entitlement, etc. That may be a good thing to do, particularly if you have a really inefficient call centre. But there's another way to have a really great call centre. Do you know what it is? Overpay people, okay? One of our clients, I probably could name that, actually, Intercontinental Hotel Group, have a fantastic call centre in the UK, which has customer satisfaction rates which are through the charts. And one of the reasons is it's not in a particularly wealthy area, but they pay very well for the area, and everybody stays for ages and gets really good at what they're doing, and likes it. And a very interesting thing, if you look at it, if you reduce the call centre salary, your salary line decreases, and you go, this is clearly a success. But what you often find is the cost of retraining is buried somewhere else. So what you're actually doing is banking an apparent saving in one place, and the costs of that activity actually are dissipated somewhere else where they're just not so visible. But they're still really big costs because you keep having to recruit people, train them up, and the people at the call centre basically aren't very good and they don't really care. So, quite a lot of the time, and this is one of my points, one of the great things about the creative mind is occasionally test counterintuitive things. I'll come to this in a second. But this is basically what happens with this arithmocracy. This is where economics should sit. Economics should be a subordinate discipline to psychology, just as biology is subordinate to chemistry, chemistry to physics, physics to maths, by and large. A simple view of science, but broadly speaking, that's how it works. What economists have done is basically distorted human behavior and stripped out everything that makes us human in an attempt to make economics sit here and pretend that you can use simple Newtonian mathematics to model human behavior. And just to prove that it's not just me talking this crap, here's a book, Complexity and the Art of Public Policy, two very, very bright people, Roland Coopers and David Cullender, and they make the point that human behavior is not like Newtonian physics. It's not an engineering problem, it's a complexity problem. It's a fundamentally complex system. Individual human behavior is complex. Mass human behavior, once you acknowledge that people are influenced by each other, that's really goddamn complex. I mean, at the Santa Fe Institute, which studies this stuff, a guy called Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, just makes the point. He said, imagine how difficult physics would be if atoms could think. And that gives you a view of how vastly different, as a scheme of things, it's much more akin to meteorology than it is to engineering. And he makes the point that lots and lots of creative people have been discounted or labelled irrational. This is a big loss. Humanists may not be able to translate their complex insights into the math underlying the policy compass, but they have important insights that have been lost to policy. So I think the most important thing we can do is try and win this argument that actually System 1 talent, empathy, human understanding, has been massively diminished in its power over business decision-making, and this is actually a really, really dangerous thing. So a few little very simple things. We have a butterfly here, partly because change, they metamorphose, but partly in acknowledgement of butterfly effects. So we have a couple of very, very simple sort of mantras. Test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. An awful lot of things are never even tried because decision-making is based on lazy assumptions about how people really decide. If you discover something that doesn't make any sense, you can make a fortune. Red Bull is my perfect example of this. It tastes disgusting, it costs a fortune, and it comes in a tiny can. Okay? Now, I mean, the people who actually researched the taste said they have never researched a drink that does worse on taste tests. I mean, typical consumer response was things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to, okay? Secondly, how the hell do you charge more? How do you charge $1.50 for a canned drink when Coke costs, at the time, about 50-60p? They made the can smaller. Unconscious inference in the human brain makes people think, ooh, there must be something really potent about that drink if it comes in such a small can. Because if I had 750 millilitres of the stuff, I'd presumably go doolally. So they've got to put it in a specially small can, which means it's really potent, which means it commands a different kind of price from ordinary carbonated drinks. But if you think about it, if you look at how we actually look at the world through market research and through economic assumption, neither of those lenses would ever have got you to Red Bull. Research would have said people don't like the taste, so there's no point in selling it. Economic logic, there's no economist and nobody in a research group is ever going to say the following sentence. No, there's no way I pay £1.50 for a canned drink. Oh, wait, hold on a second. I would if you gave me less of it. Right? Okay? There is nobody in the world in any research group or any faculty of economics who can understand the sheer brilliance of what is System 1 inference at work. Now, a really important point about economic value. Any Austrian school economists here? Ludwig von Mises, the Austrians basically believe that all value is subjective, and von Mises makes the point that there is no distinction between the value created by manufacturing and the value created by marketing. One creates the actual primary good, the other one creates the context in which that good can be appreciated, valued, or bought. And as he says, there's no point making a distinction in a restaurant between the man who cooks the food. You could produce the best Michelin-starred food in the world, okay? And if the restaurant smells of sewage, okay, no one will enjoy eating it. And in the same way, you can produce the best product in the world, and if you don't position it, frame it, tell stories about it in the right way, no one will buy it. There are fascinating products, by the way, which really intrigue me. Two of them being moist lavatory paper, which logically everybody should buy. Because, you know, there's no other part of your body where if you get it muddy or dirty, you go, oh, I've got mud on my hands. Let me rub my hands very vigorously with dry paper until it comes off, right? Okay? But your bum, for some reason, okay? Okay? Now, I've got various... I think that may be a social proof problem, that there's tons of dry lavatory paper on the shelf, and there's hardly any moist stuff. So people look at this lonely little packet of moist lavatory paper, and they go, it's clearly for deviants and people with a weird medical condition. Now, unconscious inference is really, really important, by the way, because our brain, I'll show you some of this stuff, we have not evolved to seek the truth. We have not evolved to perceive the world objectively. It is not in our evolutionary interests to perceive the world objectively, okay? Nature doesn't give a shit about truth, it cares about fitness. A really brutal thing to say. Secondly, the creatures that it most enjoyed an evolutionary advantage were not the ones that hung around for weeks waiting for perfect information. They were the animals that could make a pretty good bet quickly on what information was available at any one time. Okay? You know, that is simply how perception works. Most of your perception is a punt. It's a bet. You know those funny little pictures where you have dots on a page and they appear to be sticking out or concave, depending on which way around you turn the page? Has everybody seen those? I used to have some on the deck. I'm sorry about that. Okay? And you turn the page upside down and it reverses. What's going on there? Why are the dots one way around sticking out and the other way around sticking in? The brain's making a bet. It just goes, the ones that are dark at the top and light at the bottom, okay, they're probably sticking in, and vice versa. Why? The brain's making the assumption that it's much more common for a light source to come from above than from below. We don't know whether that's innate or whether it's learned. I do have two small babies in a cellar at the moment with a brightly lit floor, so we can find out, in strict contravention of most ethical rules about testing. But that's the brain making a bet. Pareidolia, where you see faces in things, is the brain basically making a punt. By the way, computers suffer from pareidolia, where you see faces and things, because you have to calibrate facial recognition software to a certain level of sensitivity, and the optimal level of sensitivity will generate false positives, because otherwise you get far too many false negatives. So, you know, at some point, some of this stuff is just a computational necessity anyway. Now, we also perceive the world relatively rather than absolutely, which all of you copywriters who wince are writing phrases like for the price of a cup of coffee a day, because it is the oldest cliche in copywriting history, or one of them, it's still really, really important. Because our perception of everything, heat, volume, temperature, pitch, except for the people with perfect pitch, only instance of human beings having an objective psychophysical sense is people with perfect pitch. Everything else we perceive relatively, including price. How many people have got an espresso machine? Since you're writers, I recommend them highly. Okay? Now, it's insanely expensive, okay? Okay? If you had to buy Nespresso coffee in a jar like Nescafe, then for an equivalent amount of caffeine and volume of liquid, it'd be like paying something like 68 quid for a jar of Nespresso. And you look at the Nescafe, £3.15, Nespresso, 65 quid, and you go, this is deranged, there's no way I'm paying that, right? But when you have your Nespresso machine, it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in individual pods, little metal pods, 29 pence each. They probably cost, as I would say, well, about 15 times more, maybe more, than a spoonful of Nescafe, right? Why don't we complain? Because we don't know what a spoonful of Nescafe costs. So our frame of reference is now different, because when we put the pod in and pay 29p, our frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we think, well, it's 29p, but that would cost me £2.40 at Starbucks. This machine's practically making me money. In fact, I should probably buy another one. And it is actually very, very interesting. Now, the perfect example of the advertising industry understanding anchoring and framing effects was possibly the most beautiful line ever written, even though I think it's evil, but it is brilliant, which was for De Beers, written by a female copywriter in about 1948, which was for engagement rings, how else can a month's salary last a lifetime? Which sets a brilliant anchor point and norm for how much a chap should... They actually increased it to 2 months later because they got greedy. It still worked, okay? They created an expectation in the female and an anchor point in the male as to how much you should actually spend on an engagement ring. Because you can't say, how else can $2,000 last a lifetime, because that's too much for some people, too little for others. Creating a month's salary norm, personally, I think it was exploitation of men, in my view. And I think most men interpret it to mean a month's salary after tax, to be absolutely honest. And expenses. In fact, you know, how else can a month's disposable income after beer last a lifetime? Was probably the male interpretation. By the way, does anybody know why women particularly like being bought jewellery and flowers by men? It's one of those fantastic theories in psychology. Women particularly like, as a romantic gesture, jewellery and flowers precisely because men are not remotely interested in them, right? So when you buy your wife or girlfriend flowers or jewellery for Christmas, you're spending money demonstrating commitment to her with absolute sacrifice on your part. Whereas if you buy your wife a radio-controlled helicopter for Christmas, there's a strong suspicion of self-interest. I mean, if you think about it, florists wouldn't exist in an all-male world, would they? Let's be absolutely honest about this. Well, they might, but they just sell things like Venus flytraps and cactus and kind of plants that blokes like, you know, because they're a bit fierce and mean. But anyway, the point about this arithmocracy is it creates absurd decisions. You've all seen me say this, haven't you? The Eurostar point. How many people haven't seen me say this? Only about a few. My point being that 6 billion to reduce the journey time by 25 minutes or 30 minutes between Paris and London is a kind of arithmocrat's decision. How do we measure what's good about a train? Speed, duration, you know, velocity, journey time, okay? Because it has to be numerical. My point that, you know, at 0.001% of that money had been spent putting Wi-Fi on the trains, the natural human preference for taking the train over flying would have been far more strengthened at a tiny, tiny percentage of the cost. But it's very interesting how people can't help looking at the world through a particularly dehumanized lens. My interesting alternative to High Speed 2 up to Manchester, which I think is a woefully misconceived idea, by the way. I think there are far better ideas. The high-speed line across the north will be much more economically valuable and actually significantly cheaper, for example. My other objection, by the way, to high-speed 2 is it doesn't stop anywhere in between. Okay, so I do feel a bit sorry for the people of the Chilterns who have to put up with the noise, but they don't even get a bloody station. You know, that is a bit of a... but I suggested you could actually reduce the journey time by 40 minutes to Manchester already, and increase capacity on the trains at a cost of £50,000. The way you do this is you approach the problem from a human perspective, not an engineering one. How on earth do you do that? Very simple. Every time I travel up to Manchester, which I do about 4 or 5 times a year, I buy an advance first ticket, because you get a free breakfast on Virgin, and it's about 40 quid for the advance first ticket. Whereas if you buy a first ticket on the day, it costs about £1 million. Okay? Now, most people who smartly do this. They buy an advance first. The only problem is if you miss your train, your entire ticket is now void and you have to pay £1 million for the full fare equivalent, right? So as a result, you set out insanely early, leaving an enormous margin of error, and end up turning up at Euston 45 minutes early and having to hover around Burger King for 45 minutes to wait for your train to leave. A simple mobile phone app could simply allow you to say, I'm here. Virgin would reply with, if you pay us £5, you can jump on the train that leaves in 5 minutes, not in 45 minutes, because there's a spare seat. Okay? I would then get to Manchester 40 minutes quicker without needing to disturb anybody in the Chilterns or spend £50 billion. It also improves capacity, by the way. I don't want to get into the details of yield management, but getting people to travel on an earlier... because rail seats are a perishable good, basically. Letting people travel on an earlier journey is always a good thing, because you then free up the later seat to be sold to somebody else. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I say that psychology has been completely frozen out of business decision-making, because every problem is looked at it from a dehumanized perspective. Get rid of everything human because it makes the model messy and complex, solve the dehumanized problem, then impose your solution on people. That's effectively how, you know, the kind of increasingly arithmocratic world starts to work. There are loads and loads of problems you can solve with psychology. You want people to finish their course of antibiotics. Don't give them 24 white pills, give them 18 white pills and 6 blue ones, and say, when you finish the white ones, take the blue ones. They'll finish the course of action. If you look at a car, it has a steering wheel which we steer with our hands, okay? Good car designers put a wheel on a car. Our hands did not evolve to steer cars, but you design cars to fit with our evolved physique. In the same way, you should design writing and experiences and services to work with our evolved psychology. To talk about the idea that actually acknowledging people's psychological makeup in the design of things is kind of exploitative or disingenuous, if you accept that, then you have to accept that your car is actually exploiting your hands, which should only be used for swinging from trees and sort of removing nits from each other. Although, feel free if anybody wants to, okay? Other things, the way in which we choose, economics is completely wrong about that. It thinks we weigh up different options and decide on the balance of all those options. We don't. We decide one attribute at a time. One of the most important things in writing is understanding order, the order in which people choose things, and the path dependence of choice is a really, really interesting area to actually discuss. Has anybody ever driven down the M20 towards the M25, needing to turn off either south or north on the M25? Has anybody done that and missed the turning? Yeah, interesting. Every single room I've been in, somebody has made this mistake. And it's actually fascinating. This is, I think, the best bit of creative work I've done all year, weirdly, although I made no money out of it at all. Because I've driving back from Deal on the last 9 occasions, I missed this turning 3 or 4 times. And at that point, I thought, hold on a second. You know, it's possible that I'm a complete idiot, but I don't generally make that mistake anywhere else in the motorway network. Maybe it's not me, it's them. Now, what's interesting is I had no idea of what might be wrong because you drive using System 1 for the most part. It's an instinctive thing. So fortunately, I was able to go to Google Street View. This is what you first get. There's no indication of the distance to the junction. There's no 1 mile, 2 miles, 1.5 miles. There's no primary route mentioned. It doesn't mention Stansted or Gatwick. It mentions Swanley, which is completely useless information because Swanley is the name of the junction. So no one has any clue whether that's north or south of the M20 anyway, okay? And you go, I don't really understand that sign. The only mention of the M25 is there. There are no other destinations mentioned. And you go, but that's okay, because there's a gantry over there. I can see one coming in about 2/3 of a mile. So I'll use the information on that sign, and I'll decide which lane I need to be in. And this is what happens. Before you can even read what's on that sign, it forcibly divides the road into 2. And by the time you can read the sign, well, basically, you have 2 choices. You carry on for 8 miles and go back through Orpington or double back on yourself, or you do an incredibly dangerous swerve into the left-hand lane. So you are forgiven for making that mistake. I sent it into the Highways Agency and expecting nothing, to be absolutely honest. And someone very nice phoned back and said, we had a meeting yesterday and we agree with you. This is completely ridiculous. But it's very, very easy. Now, let me give an example. Most airline websites effectively make the mistake of asking you to make a decision before you have the information required to make that decision. Now, if you're a business traveller, it's fine. Where do you want to go, when, what class of travel? Those are the first 3 questions, okay? Now, broadly speaking, if you're a business traveller, your class of travel is determined by your client or by your employer. Your date of travel and destination is determined by your boss or your client. It's very rare my boss says to me, next week, Rory, somewhere between Wednesday and Friday, I'd like you to go somewhere sunny. Okay? Generally, they have a specific place in mind, okay? Now, however, if you look at an airline website from the point of view of a leisure traveller, the entire order is wrong. Where do you want to go? When? Well, actually, I have only the vaguest idea of when. That for many of those leisure travellers, actually what they really want is an order of choice which goes, show me some really cheap flights and I'll go to one of those places. You know, I mean, pissed-up students will basically go to Warsaw in February if the flights are cheap, right? Okay? So, the order is totally wrong. Then it asks you a totally absurd question when you think about it. What class of travel would you want? Well, it's a very easy answer to that, isn't it? First. But it kind of depends on how much it costs. I mean, we all want to go first class, right? If it costs 10 quid more, we'll all go first. If it's £5,000 more, then we frankly won't, okay? So they were asking you a question to decide something on the basis rather like that road sign. Now, they now make an extra, I can't tell you the exact amount, but it's an extra 8-figure sum in sterling in annual revenue, okay? Simply because now if you ask for an economy ticket, they will also show you the business and the premium economy price. because they were losing a fortune by appalling choice architecture. If you want an example of surviving shit choice architecture, those machines that sell you railway tickets, right? Now, on southeastern trains, there's a thing called an off-peak first, which isn't much more expensive than off-peak second. And you have to do it because you want a table, right? That's what you really need on a train, isn't it? It's not speed. I want to create a thing called the LTT, which is the large table train. Because the whole point of train travel is not that it's fast or efficient or whatever. The whole point is it's the only form of travel where you can basically have a laptop, a cup of coffee, a newspaper, and you're just as productive as you are anywhere else. That's the real train technology, not speed. But the point I'm making is they make it much harder to order a first-class fare than a second-class one. Those of you, by the way, online, if you book tickets in advance, it's not uncommon for the first-class fare to be cheaper than the second-class fare on train journeys. Everybody found that? Or at least just comically less, £1 more. The reason is no one's even looking at the first-class fare. Now, okay, if the first-class fare is 10 times as much, there's not much point in giving it huge prominence, okay? But a lot of the time it isn't. It's 20% more, 30% more. That's an example where people just assume, I'm not even going to bother to look at first because it's going to be £1 million. And actually, you're throwing away opportunities to upgrade people simply through the sort of path dependence of choice. How much time have I got? 5 minutes, 10? I've got five, okay. Wine, you don't choose wine. Your restaurant chooses it for you, just to explain how you can nudge people. Restaurants want to sell wine because there's no known price for wine, so you can mark it up egregiously in a way you can't mark up gin, because people know what gin costs in the shops. Whereas you sell a bottle of Chateau de, pretentious 1964, whatever, nobody really knows what it costs. How do they do this? No, because one of my weird arguments is people drink far too much wine, because without food it's not a very good drink anyway. And a lot of it is rubbish. Does anybody agree? Spirits and beer have the virtue of consistency, in my view. They do not disappoint. But you get to the restaurant. This is just an example of how choice works. You get to the restaurant. The first thing you notice is there are wine glasses already on the table. That's a bit of a presumptuous nudge. Then they hand you a drinks list, which isn't called a drinks list. It's called a wine list, of which 8 pages consists of wine, and then there's 1 page at the back for spirits and beer, which makes you feel faintly deviant just for looking at it, okay? So the whole framing of the choice thing changes things. And then there's the final act of genius I pointed out. I only noticed this 2 weeks ago. They only hand a table of 5 or 6 or 4. They only hand out 1 wine list or 1 drinks list. What's brilliant about that, you see, is once you assume that one person is going to order alcoholic drink for the whole table, there's only 1 drink they can order, which is wine, because no other drink... You're not going to say, I'll have a 2-litre bottle of Vimto, right? Okay? So there's only 1 drink you can order. So the chap then says to the table, red or white. Everybody expresses a preference and assumes that that's what they wanted to drink all along. In reality, you have actually been led through an extraordinary veil of nudges to make sure that's what you drink. And so, I find the whole idea of choice architecture and the whole idea of, unconscious cues absolutely fascinating. So just to be clear, Ogilvy Change are 2 mantras. Test counterintuitive things, because often in a complex system, the relationship between an intervention and its outcome is not necessarily intuitively obvious. If you want to reduce littering on the New York subway, weirdly, the thing that worked best was getting rid of the bins. Now, that is really weird, okay? I couldn't make sense of it either. What they found is they got rid of the bins for reasons of security. They found that what actually happened with bins is that bins would overflow or get full. So someone would put their empty coffee cup on top of the bin, then the coffee cup fell off the bin onto the floor, where it created a social norm that it was okay to chuck your coffee cup on the floor. No bins, people took their cups. Now, maybe they went up on the street and chucked them around there, so you have to check there isn't a spillover effect. But very often, so test counterintuitive things. The other thing is, very small things can have big effects. So our second slogan of Ogilvy Change is, dare to be trivial. Most people with a big budget feel they have to do big budget things. But as that example with the call center shows, adding a sentence adding a few sentences can double conversion on a call center. Adding a sentence in a piece of copy, if it's a tiny bit of social proof, or scarcity bias, only 4 seats left at this price, reply before the 15th of December, offer ends. Those tiny little things effectively unlock parts of the human brain. The way to look at persuasion in the human brain is it's not like pushing against another force. There are certain things which simply need to be unlocked. It may be the social proof thing. How many other people have bought this? How many people are looking at this hotel? If you want a really interesting Darwinian finding, by the way, by a guy called Griscovicius, if you show people a romantic film, the most powerful message is actually, they did a wonderful experiment with an ad for a museum saying, a really distinctive way to spend the day. This is an unusual thing to do. After a romantic film was a very, very powerful argument. After a horror film, the most effective argument was the complete opposite. 5,000 people go to this museum every day. In evolutionary terms, the brain is multimodular. If you're thinking of basically, if you're in, I don't know how to put this, this is not a scientific term. If you're in pulling mode, okay, because you've been primed romantically, you need to make yourself stand out, okay? And if you're in fear mode, you want to fit in. So even tiny little nudges like that will depend on the context in which they're actually deployed. This is a brilliant case. Google the website, the $300 million button. Simply because it's a case where partly path dependence. They added a button, instead of sign in or register for the checkout procedure of what I think was the Best Buy website in the US, they added a third button that just said continue, and it said you don't need to register to shop with us, but we'll give you a chance to save your details later. Now, the fascinating thing was not only that it added $300 million in sales the following year in terms of a diminution of lost checkout opportunities. The really fascinating thing is of the people who clicked that button, 90% of them were totally happy to leave their details after they'd placed an order. Something in our evolutionary psychology must say, deep in our lizard brain, I feel really uneasy handing over this information before I have to. There must be something about our inner game theorist, which is withhold this stuff until the last possible minute. Once they've said your fridge is on its way, people are totally happy then to leave all their details. Now, that is extraordinary because such a small thing can have such a huge effect. And I presented that, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, I spent the 1980s working with HIV patients in New Orleans. And she said, the bizarre thing we found was exactly parallel to this. People came in for an HIV test. Bear in mind, in the late 80s, early 90s, this was quite a new phenomenon. And they said, what's your name? And people said, I'm not giving it, and they disappeared, which frightened them enormously. Now, the problem was they did at some stage need to find out people's names. They discovered a very interesting thing. You gave them an anonymous number. They had the test. After they'd had the test, it made no difference, virtually, whether it was a positive or negative result. At that point, they were completely happy to leave their name. Now, in conventional economic terms, this doesn't make any sense. But order effects. Has anybody read Robert Cialdini's latest book, Big Small? Okay, definitely look at this. It's a whole list of behavioural examples where tiny little tweaks can have huge effects. The addition of a small sentence, most people do this, can have absolutely enormous effects. Little reciprocal gestures can have enormous effects. Now, to understand all this, we need to understand parts of the brain that I don't think are well understood either by marketers or by economists. And the reason they're not well understood is that the parts of the brain that in a sense are most important to our survival are actually instinctive. And the system 1 parts of the brain, this takes a lot of accepting about yourselves as well, okay? They're not, the way they're occasionally described is a large part of your mental decision-making apparatus is actually opaque to introspection. In other words, decisions are influenced emotionally by parts of the brain which simply aren't connected to our capacity for speech or verbalization at all. Okay? The other problem is the part of our brain that does the verbalizing is deluded. So when you ask people why they did things, the answer to the question is basically a post-rationalization of a decision that was taken elsewhere in the brain. Jonathan Haidt put this most brilliantly. The conscious human brain thinks it's the Oval Office when in reality it's mostly the press office. Most of the time it's hastily contriving justifications for decisions taken somewhere else. It's not actually making the decisions, but it believes it does. And so when you ask people why they do things or what matters to them, the answers you get are simply not reliable. I'll give you a very interesting example. If you take airline lounges, okay? If you talk to people about what makes a good airline lounge, they'll talk about plugs, right? And they'll talk about booze, and they'll talk about tables, they'll talk about chairs, okay? The real reason I would surmise people go to airline lounges is actually not really to do with any of those things. It's actually that they're an area of heightened trust. That in an airline lounge you can leave your laptop on the table and wander off to the loo. Right? I'm not saying the people in the lounge are honest, they're just not the kind of crooks who steal laptops, okay? They're financial services crooks. But the point I'm making is that things like, ooh, it feels like trusty in here and I can leave my laptop and go and wander and look at sandwiches, okay? That instinct and that emotion comes from part of the brain which isn't very gabby. Whereas the bit that goes, oh, it's brilliant in the Lufthansa one, they got Johnny Walker Black, okay? That comes from the gabby part of the brain. And the problem with market research is that the yucky part of the brain does all the talking, whereas the vastly more important instinctive parts of the brain, by and large, remain silent, while this sort of... It's effectively, this bullshitter strapped to your forehead in evolutionary terms, is effectively coming up with plausible explanations. So a wonderful example is Halo, which I think is a fantastic psychological... You can always phone for a cab. There's nothing that radical about this, right? The real difference is we really, really hate uncertain bad news. The combination of a bad thing and the uncertainty of that bad thing scares the crap out of us. The joy of Halo is actually not that it's faster, more efficient. In numerical terms, it is not a very significant product. In psychological terms, it is a huge deal because previously you rang for a cab and for the next 10 minutes you were in the twilight zone of, is he here yet? Maybe he's gone. Go outside and see if he's parked round the corner. They said 10 minutes, why isn't he here? When you can watch the cab approach on a map, it's a totally chilled and pleasant experience. Oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll have another pint. Okay? So this is... a few really important things. The conscious part of the brain actually doesn't do the deciding, but it thinks it does. Moreover, that means it doesn't describe accurately the things that really are decisive in human behaviour. It talks about, effectively, a kind of bogus rationalisation of behaviour. Second thing is, it's not in our evolutionary interest to perceive the world objectively. It's in our evolutionary interest to make bets on what information is available. Now, with verbal information, we make enormous between-the-line inferences. What is the style of the person writing this? Can I trust this person from the way they write? And actually, like a poker player, we trust our inferences more than the writer's claims. Because the writer is it's a Mandy Rhinestafis. You would say that, wouldn't you? Okay? What we're looking for is clues from the style of writing, the information provided. We trust our inferences like a poker player. We're more interested in the wiggle of an eye than we are in the actual overt behaviour of the person opposite. I'll very quickly, I'll skip that. We don't perceive the world objectively. Cover the middle gap with your hand, and you'll actually see this isn't a white panel and a grey one. The top and the bottom, if you hold your hand up, are actually exactly the same shade of grey. That's just the brain making a bet from what information is available about what it's likely to be seeing. I'll skip this for reasons of time. 5 things people really care about. System 1 really cares about these things, but we don't talk about them much because these are so important to us as humans. They've actually gone into the automatic part of our brain rather than being bolted on in the conscious bit. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness.
So
and I'll just end on
experiment
fairness,
that I want to mention to you
and then I'm
is
off.
our fairness
Just to prove
study.
that an instinct for fairness, if you can have the sound
up. A very
up.
famous study, and there's now many more.
There we are, pop that on.
After we
Actually
did this about 10
predates
years
humanity.
Ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
And thank you very much indeed. Do you want questions, or are we running over? Yeah, of course. Absolutely delighted, yeah.
Have you got any questions, Rory?
Yes.
So, as a behavioural economist, I work for the Wales Centre for Behaviour Change, and I'm just wondering where the responsibility lies in terms of generating this evidence base. Do you think there's part of the responsibility is with the companies to support the copywriters and to generate the evidence base to see what the next vogue type of copy is? Or
I think the answer is that copywriters who are, I would put in the list with Kuiper's and Callender's view of the kind of people who have insights into human behaviour that have been discounted as irrational. The responsibility of companies is to create a better decision-making framework so that those voices can be better heard and also heard earlier. I've often suggested a really good large company should have a board-level director of detail, which is a person who's responsible. They've got a lot of power but no budget. So their job is to look at the small things that you could change that would make a really immense difference. For instance, now let me give you an example. I worked as a direct marketing copywriter. I still am a direct marketing copywriter at heart for 10 or 12 years. And what was interesting to me was it was absolutely obvious to me that financial products were psychologically awful. This is before we had the Save More Tomorrow pension by Thaler and Bernarzi, but the whole idea that a 25-year-old should put money away, which they won't see until they're 65, that they should put away the same amount every month, that there should be no tapering in of the amount they pay, struck me as psychologically dumb, okay? And the problem I found was that economic assumptions about what is rational behaviour were so strong that mentioning psychology within the financial world, which is heavily dominated by a kind of left-brain personality, would get you no traction at all. Now, that is slowly changing. A very interesting example I'll give you of something else I spotted, which is I tried this experiment with an audience of 500 people, all working for one of Britain's two largest retail banking chains, okay? And I said to the audience, anybody in this room, if I were to offer you £200 in cash, and I said, you can keep that, provided you pay £200 into your pension before you get home this evening, how many of you would know how to do it? Nobody. Next audience, 200 people. How many people would know how to top up their pension on impulse, as it were? Nobody. Actually, no, the next audience, one person did, and they worked for Goldman Sachs. So they weren't exactly representative, okay? Now, this is something really fascinating, isn't it? Because two things happen. One, nobody knows how to top up their pension. Now, if you have an unexpected windfall, not a bad thing to do, given the tax position, is to top up your pension. Nobody knows how to do it, to start with, so they don't do it. But also, the fact that it's difficult to do makes people assume that you shouldn't do it. Because they think, well, if I was supposed to top up my pension, with 50 quid here and there every time I had a bit of a lucky win, okay, my bank would have made it easy for me to do. But the fact that the bank hasn't done it means I'm probably not supposed to do it. Do you see what I mean? We make those inferences, second-order inferences, all over the place. So you have this extraordinary thing that the government funds pensions, and I would argue that more than 50% of the government money that goes into matching, tax relief on pension contributions is there really simply to counterbalance the appalling way in which they're designed. And so my argument is we have to go in, just as with car design, people don't design steering wheels to be square because our hands aren't. We have to keep going in and being really noisy with this stuff. Because when I say there are, in the case of that appalling signage, that's a case where I would argue one person a year is going to die because of that. Okay? In some financial products. Now, someone told me in Canada there's some new pension product where the money you put in, first of all, goes into a sort of short-term savings account, and then that fills up, and it pours over into a medium-term savings account, and it's a kind of, it's a kind of progressive thing. Now, that, I think, works with a 25 or 30-year-old's brain, doesn't it? Okay, so I put this money in, and I can get it back if I've got a party to go to, but by default, it will keep topping up until it flows over into a pension once I've got enough money that I can actually get my hands on straight away. Okay? So one more question, and then I'm sorry, I feel guilty because So militant subjectivity is what I'm asking for, I think. Any more? One, fine, and then I'll be very quick this time, I promise, sorry, I hope.
Just out of interest, I wanted to ask, you're obviously really aware of the tricks of the trades in kind of retail, how people get you to buy more, spend more, get things you don't want or need. Do you find yourself kind of subconsciously, quietly rebelling against that? Or do you you're aware of it and you just do it anyway?
Don't get me wrong, I think there are cases where people are woefully misled into doing things that they shouldn't do. And I think you can use nudging for evil, okay? The only thing I would say is that in making purchases, for many people most of the time, the default mode is, if in doubt, don't. So I think there are very, very good purchases which aren't bought because of a tiny element of fear or unfamiliarity or doubt. And actually I think that, reading Cialdini is interesting, that many, many people will always default to habit and they'll always default to social proof, by and large, because of defensive decision-making. And the role of marketing in actually overcoming that, in making people just a bit braver. So it's complicated. Yes, you can, emphatically, you can seduce people down a path of behaviour where, bait and switch would be, a real example, where you create such a sunk cost. I'm getting to the end of that airline website where you think you're flying for 28 quid and it says, after you've spent 5 minutes inputting details on the form, it says, oh, by the way, it's 20 quid extra to check in. Okay, that's a con. That's exploiting people's sunk cost bias. It should be, well, at the very least, disparaged and possibly banned. Okay, equally, it's worth remembering that there are many, many people whose default mode, as one economist put it, they're agoraphobic in the true sense of the word. They've got a fear of the marketplace. And before they will do anything, they require, enormous amounts of reassurance. And so, anything you can do in terms of lots of people do this, look at these people, etc., is actually important, because some people, we always talk about the people who become spendthrift. But George Lowenstein, for example, the behavioural scientist, says there's actually a larger group of people who are actually skinflints. They actually spend too little. And that's particularly strong, by the way, if you're talking about intangibles. There's a very particular kind of person who just about is okay to spend money on a car, but it kills them to spend money on a taxi. So we have to look at this from both sides. There's never been a newspaper, but actually the mean outnumber the spendthrift by quite a ratio. So it's marketing in that case is a complicated question. Thanks very much. I'll leave that there.